The glow of a rest stop sign on a deserted highway can be a welcome sight on a long, dark journey. It's a beacon in the oppressive blackness of a rural interstate, promising a moment of relief, a place to stretch your legs, refuel your vehicle, and take a brief break from the hypnotic monotony of the road. These small islands of concrete and dim lighting are supposed to be sanctuaries for the weary traveler, but for some, they are anything but. The very isolation that makes them a necessity also makes them a hunting ground. What happens when that beacon of light doesn't lead to safety, but instead guides you directly into a nightmare you can't wake up from? What happens when the person in the stall next to you, or the truck parked beside your car, has no intention of letting you leave? Tonight, we have 3 accounts inspired by real events that happened to people who pulled into the most dangerous rest stops. These are stories from individuals who were simply looking for a moment of peace and instead found themselves in a fight for their lives, or worse, sleeping just feet away from a horror they couldn't possibly imagine. While exact crime statistics for rest stops can be hard to nail down, law enforcement agencies have documented everything from theft and drug trafficking to assault and even murder at these locations. These encounters will make you lock your doors, check your mirrors, and perhaps just keep on driving. Story 1. Our first story is based on an experience from a man we'll call David. A few years ago, David was tackling a grueling 12-hour drive from his home in southern Indiana to visit family in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. To make good time and avoid traffic, he decided to drive through the night. The road was his, a black ribbon unfurling under the high beams of his sedan. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the green, glowing mile markers slipping past his window. Around 2 in the morning, his body sent him an urgent signal. His eyes were heavy, and the need for a bathroom was becoming impossible to ignore. Up ahead, a sign materialized from the darkness. Rest area, 1 mile. It was a wave of pure relief. He pulled off the highway and into a facility that seemed almost comically desolate. There were only 2 other cars in the parking lot, both parked far from the main building, their interiors dark and still. A handful of semi-trucks were lined up in their designated spots, their engines rumbling with a low, guttural hum that seemed to be the only sound in the world. The building itself was a standard brick affair, its fluorescent lights casting a sickly yellow-green haze on the pavement. David parked close to the entrance, a small precaution he always took when traveling alone at night. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was immense, broken only by the distant thrum of the trucks. He took a deep breath, locked his car, and made his way toward the men's room. The heavy doors sighed open with a metallic groan, and he stepped inside. The air was cool and thick with the sterile scent of industrial cleaner. The room was empty. It was divided into 2 sections, with a long bank of sinks and mirrors on one side and a row of stalls on the other. The lighting in here was even worse than outside. Several overhead fixtures were burnt out, casting long, deep shadows that seemed to writhe in his peripheral vision. An unsettling quiet hung in the air, a stillness that felt charged and unnatural. For a moment, David considered just turning around, getting back in his car, and holding it until the next town. But the drive had been long, and he was desperate. He walked past the first few stalls, his footsteps echoing unnervingly in the tiled space. He chose a stall about halfway down, seeking the illusion of privacy it offered. He slid the flimsy lock into place and settled in, the silence of the room pressing in on him. He was just starting to relax when he heard it, the same metallic groan from the main door. Someone else had come in. This was perfectly normal, of course. Rest stops are for public use, and people travel at all hours. He told himself it was no big deal. He heard soft, slow footsteps. They weren't the confident, purposeful steps of someone coming in to use the facilities and get back on the road. These were hesitant, measured. They shuffled across the tiled floor, each soft scuff sending a fresh prickle of unease up David's spine. He tried to ignore it, telling himself he was just tired and letting the eerie atmosphere get to him. But then, the footsteps stopped. Directly outside of his stall, David froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. He strained his ears, listening for any sound, a cough, a clearing of the throat, the jangle of keys, anything that would indicate this was just another traveler. But there was nothing. Only a dead, suffocating silence. He held his breath, his heart beginning to thrum against his ribs like a trapped bird. He could feel, more than see, the presence of someone standing just on the other side of the thin metal door. Then he heard a new sound, a soft, wet, rhythmic sound. It was breathing, but it was too loud, too heavy. It was the labored breathing of someone trying to be quiet, their breath hitching with some unknown exertion or excitement. A shadow shifted in the gap beneath the stall door. It was just a flicker at first, but then it grew, darkening the small sliver of light from the main room. Someone was leaning down. David's blood ran cold. This wasn't normal. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was it a maintenance worker? A lost child? Every rational explanation felt thin and pathetic in the face of the oppressive dread that was now filling the tiny stall. The heavy breathing continued, a constant, unnerving presence just inches away from him. And then it happened. The shadow under the door solidified into a shape. Fingers. Pale, dirty fingers curled under the bottom edge of the stall door, gripping the cold metal. They were tentative at first, then they grew bolder, trying to get a purchase, trying to lift the door from its hinges. David could see the dirt packed under the nails, the tension in the knuckles. His breath hitched in his throat, a silent scream building in his chest. As the fingers pulled, a new shadow joined the first. A face. A human face was pressing itself flat against the floor, trying to peer through the inch-wide gap at the bottom of the door. The man's cheek was smooshed against the grimy tile, and his eyes were wide, round, and unblinking. They were staring directly at David. There was no recognition in them, no humanity. It was a vacant, predatory stare, like that of a shark. The man's lips were pulled back in a grimace, and the heavy breathing he'd been hearing was coming from this face on the floor. Time seemed to stop. For a horrifying second, David was paralyzed, locked in this grotesque, one-sided staring contest. The man's fingers kept pulling, the door groaning under the strain. The image of those wide, dead eyes was burned into his brain. Finally, the spell of fear broke, and a surge of pure, primal adrenaline flooded his system. "Get away from me!" David roared, his voice cracking. With all the force he could muster, he kicked the stall door. His foot connected with a deafening bang that echoed through the bathroom like a gunshot. The door shuddered, and he heard a startled yelp from the other side. The fingers vanished, the face disappeared. He heard a frantic scrambling sound, the scuffing of shoes on tile, and then a string of incoherent muttering. The man was backing away. David didn't wait. His business was forgotten, his exhaustion completely gone, replaced by a singular, desperate need to escape. He fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking so violently he could barely slide the bolt. He threw the door open and burst out of the stall. He half expected the man to be waiting for him, but the bathroom was empty again. The only sign that anything had happened was the faint, lingering smell of unwashed bodies. He didn't scan the corners. He just ran. He burst through the main door and into the cold night air, his lungs burning. He glanced wildly around the parking lot, his heart hammering against his ribs. And then he saw him, the man. He was just strolling. He was walking calmly toward one of the two cars parked in the distance, as if he had just stopped to admire the stars. The sheer normalcy of it was almost as terrifying as the encounter itself. David didn't hesitate. He sprinted to his sedan, yanking the door open and throwing himself inside. He slammed the door, the sound of the locks engaging, offering a tiny, pathetic sense of security. His hands were still trembling as he grabbed his phone and dialed 911. He breathlessly explained what had happened, watching the man get into his car. To his immense relief, a state trooper was patrolling nearby. Within minutes, flashing blue and red lights filled his rearview mirror as a cruiser screamed into the rest stop. The police arrested the man on the spot. They later told David that this wasn't his first offense. He had a record of similar incidents, a voyeur who got his thrills from terrorizing people in their most vulnerable moments. David never followed up to check the police report. He didn't want to know the man's name or see his face again. The memory of those wide, unblinking eyes staring up from the filthy floor was a haunting he would carry with him forever. To this day, he can't use a public restroom without his heart pounding, without checking the gap under the door, forever waiting to see a shadow that isn't his own. An encounter like David's is a terrifying violation, a slow burn horror that preys on our sense of privacy and security. But not all encounters are so subtle. Sometimes the threat doesn't hide in the shadows. Sometimes it parks right next to you, gets in your face, and makes its intentions perfectly clear. Our next story is inspired by an incident in a remote mountain pass where a stop for a quick snack nearly became someone's last. Story 2. This account is based on the experience of a woman we'll call Jessica. She was in her early 20s, driving through a mountainous region on her way to a new job in a different state. It was late, around 10 o'clock at night, and the highway had grown increasingly isolated. The towering trees on either side of the road seemed to swallow the headlights, creating a tunnel of darkness. She was getting hungry and saw a sign for a rest stop. It was perched on the side of a mountain, a lonely outpost against the vast, starry sky. Deciding a quick snack was in order, she pulled in. The place felt profoundly empty. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights under the main shelter was loud and aggressive in the otherwise silent night. There were maybe 40 empty parking spots, gleaming under the harsh lights. Far off to one side, a single semi-truck was parked, its engine off, its cab dark. Jessica parked her small coupe in a well-lit spot, right near the vending machines, feeling a small measure of safety in the visibility. She got out, stretched, and walked over to the machines, the cool mountain air biting at her skin. The world felt still and peaceful. She fumbled with some dollar bills, bought a bag of chips and a soda, and turned to head back to her car. That's when she heard it, a high-pitched squeal of tires that cut through the silence like a knife. From the on-ramp, a massive beat-up pickup truck came screaming into the rest area. It didn't slow down. It barreled through the empty lot at a speed that was both reckless and menacing. Jessica froze, her snack forgotten in her hands, and watched as the truck swerved aggressively and fishtailed to a halt. It parked directly next to her car, so close that the passenger side of the truck was mere inches from her driver's side door. A cold knot of dread formed in the pit of her stomach. The truck was old, rusted, and covered in a layer of grime. The windows were so dirty she couldn't see inside. But the most unnerving part was the parking job. Out of 40 empty, clearly marked spaces, he had chosen to park in a way that completely blocked her from getting into her car on the driver's side. The engine wasn't turned off. It idled with a deep, threatening rumble. No one got out. Jessica stood there for a long moment, her mind trying to process the situation. Maybe it was a mistake. She waited, expecting a door to open, an apology to be shouted. Nothing. Just the low, ominous hum of the engine. A voice in her head screamed at her to run, but where would she go? She was on foot, in the middle of nowhere. Her car was her only escape, and it was currently being held hostage. This kind of intimidation is a real fear for travelers, especially women, who report feeling unsafe at truck stops almost twice as often as men. She decided to play it cool, to act as if this wasn't the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to her. She nonchalantly began to circle around the front of her car, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her plan was to get in through the passenger side. It was her only option. She kept her eyes on the truck's dark windows, expecting a face to appear at any moment. Still, nothing. The truck just sat there, rumbling, waiting. She reached the passenger side of her coupe, her hand shaking as she pulled the keys from her pocket. She slid the key into the lock. This was an older car without a remote, and turned it. The click of the lock disengaging sounded like a thunderclap in the quiet lot. She pulled the handle, opened the door, and began to slide into the seat. Suddenly, a shape detached itself from the deeper shadows near the edge of the rest stop building. It was a man, a huge, burly man, who moved with a speed that defied his size. Before Jessica could even register his presence, he was on her. He lunged at her car, his massive hand slamming onto the open passenger door, stopping her from closing it. "You ain't leaving yet," he growled. The voice was low, gravelly, and full of malice. His face was inches from hers. His eyes were wide and frantic, bloodshot and wild in the sickly fluorescent light. He smelled of stale beer and sweat. The sheer force of his presence was overwhelming. Panic, pure and undiluted, surged through her. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a predator who had her cornered. Her mind went blank with terror. All she could think about was the man's grip on her door and the wild look in his eyes. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, chilling whisper. "By the time the cops get here," he snarled, a cruel smile twisting his lips, "you'll already be dead." That single sentence, that direct and unambiguous threat, shattered her paralysis. It was like a switch was flipped in her brain, from prey to survivor. Fight or flight kicked in, and she chose to fight. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength she didn't know she possessed, she drew her leg back and kicked out with all her might. Her foot connected solidly with his stomach. The man let out a loud "oof" and stumbled backward, his hand flying off her car door. He doubled over, cursing, gasping for air. It was the only opening she would get. She yanked her leg back in, slammed the door shut, and frantically hit the lock button. She threw the keys into the ignition, her hands shaking so badly it took 2 tries to get it in. The engine roared to life. relief, she slammed the car into reverse, not even looking, and stomped on the gas. The tires squealed in protest as the small coupe shot backward. In her rearview mirror, she saw the man, now recovered, scrambling back toward his pickup truck. He was yelling something she couldn't hear, his face contorted in a mask of rage. She didn't wait to see if he would give chase. She wrenched the wheel, put the car in drive, and floored it. She peeled out of the rest stop and onto the highway on-ramp. Her gaze was fixed on the road ahead, but her mind was consumed by the image of the man scrambling for his truck. For the next 2 hours, she drove at speeds she would never admit to, her eyes glued to the rearview mirror, convinced that at any moment the headlights of that rusted pickup would appear behind her. Every pair of headlights that appeared in the distance sent a fresh jolt of terror through her. She didn't slow down. She drove until the sun began to hint at the horizon, until she was in a different state, in a busy, populated area. Only then did she allow herself to pull into a brightly lit, crowded gas station and finally breathe. She later called her dad, her voice still trembling as she recounted the story. He was horrified and begged her not to call the police, afraid it might only draw more attention from the man. Reluctantly, she agreed, but she never forgot. The man's growled threat is a permanent reminder that some of the most dangerous monsters are just waiting for you to pull over. The most terrifying things aren't always the ones you see coming. A direct threat is a horror you can at least react to. But what about the dangers that are silent? The ones that sit just inches away while you sleep, completely unaware of the peril you're in. For our final story, we learn about a person who woke up in the middle of a nightmare they didn't even know was happening. Story 3. Our final story comes from an experience shared by a man we'll call Mark. Mark was driving westbound on I-94, crossing from Wisconsin into Minnesota. It was about 8 o'clock in the evening, but the winter sky was already pitch black. He was bone-tired and knew pushing on would be dangerous. He just needed a few hours of sleep to clear his head. He saw the familiar blue sign for a rest area and pulled off the highway. The lot was quiet and relatively empty. Following the conventional wisdom for overnighting in your car, he found a spot directly under one of the tall, humming parking lot lights. He backed into the spot, locked all his doors, reclined his seat, and used his jacket as a makeshift blanket. He was exhausted enough that sleep came almost instantly. Sometime during the night, he vaguely registered a vehicle pulling into the spot next to him. In his half-conscious state, he registered it as a truck of some kind but paid it no mind. Rest stops are for resting after all. He rolled over and descended back into a deep, dreamless sleep. He was ripped from that sleep by a sudden, violent flash of light. Red and blue strobing lights painted the interior of his car in frantic, repeating flashes. His eyes flew open, his heart instantly racing. His first thought was that a cop was telling him he couldn't sleep here. He sat up, his mind groggy, and peered out his window. His car was surrounded. There were police cruisers everywhere, their emergency lights silently screaming in the darkness. He saw one officer approach the vehicle parked next to him, a red pickup truck parked so close he could have reached out and touched it. The officer shone a high-powered flashlight into the cab. Mark watched, his confusion turning to alarm as the officer recoiled from the window. The officer stumbled back a few steps, his hand flying to his radio. Mark couldn't hear what he said, but then he heard another officer closer to his own car yell a single sharp word that cut through the night. Fuck! Suddenly, the entire rest stop erupted into controlled chaos. More squads began to arrive, and officers started unrolling a long ribbon of yellow crime scene tape. Mark watched in stunned disbelief as they began to cordon off a large section of the parking lot. The tape was strung from a light pole to a police cruiser and then to the signpost right in front of his car. He was inside a crime scene. The epicenter was the red truck parked inches away. His heart was a jackhammer in his chest. He had been sleeping here, peacefully, for hours. He stayed perfectly still, terrified to move. Through the strobing lights, he could see officers swarming around the red truck, taking photos, talking into their radios with grim expressions. He had been sleeping, completely vulnerable, just a thin sheet of glass and metal separating him from whatever was in that truck. Eventually, there was a sharp rap on his driver's side window. An officer was shining a flashlight into his car. Mark slowly rolled down his window. "Evening," the officer said, his voice low and calm. "We need you to stay in your vehicle. We're going to have a detective speak with you in a few minutes." What happened?" Mark stammered. The officer's gaze flickered over to the red truck before meeting Mark's eyes again. "We found a body," he said, the words hanging in the cold night air. "During a routine check of the lot, a trooper discovered a deceased individual inside that truck. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. A body, a dead person. He had been sleeping less than 5 feet away from a murder scene. The exhaustion he'd felt earlier was gone, replaced by a hyper-aware terror. Who was in the truck? How did they die? And more terrifyingly, was the person responsible still out there, perhaps watching from the woods that bordered the rest stop? A detective eventually came and questioned him. Mark explained that he'd been asleep, had vaguely heard the truck pull in, but saw nothing and no one. After what felt like an eternity, they told him he was free to go. The sun was now rising. The lot was still a hive of activity. As he slowly pulled out, he took one last look at the scene. He had pulled into this rest stop seeking safety. Instead, he had unknowingly spent the night next to death. While theft is the most common crime at rest stops, violent crimes including assault, robbery, and homicide do occur. His close call was a chilling reminder that your life doesn't just depend on your own actions, but on the silent, unseen horrors that might be unfolding just a few feet away. 3 different people, 3 different highways, 3 different ordinary moments that curdled into unforgettable nightmares. A man violated in a moment of vulnerability, a woman threatened with her life, and another man who slept unknowingly beside a grim discovery. Their stories are inspired by the real dangers that travelers face. The late night hours between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. are when nearly half of all criminal activity at rest stops occurs. The darkness on those lonely highways can hide more than just the road ahead. It makes you wonder how many other stories like this are out there, untold. So the next time you're on a long drive and you see that welcoming blue sign glowing in the distance, remember these stories. Remember what can be lurking in the shadows just beyond the reach of those buzzing fluorescent lights. You might just want to lock your doors, grip your steering wheel a little tighter, and keep on driving. If you have a true scary story you'd like to share, you can submit it to the email address in the description below. For more unsettling stories that will make you question your surroundings, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Stay safe out there.